We have studied the HOS model, and this model is very powerful, and as I showed in the previous lecture video, it led to a lot of research on the empirical side. And what we can conclude based on the research on the empirical side, or whether it applies to real world situations or not, we believe it does, and it does explain a part of foreign trade. In this lecture, and this is the last one on the HOS model, we'll look at what happens if some of the theoretical assumptions of HOS are violated, and that's also led to a lot of active research on HOS model or an extension thereof. HOS model assumed there are two countries, two factors of production, and two commodities. And some economists felt, what happens when we apply this to the entire world? Or in other words, we are looking at a very large number of countries, a large number of commodities, and a large number of factors of production. And what happens when we extend that? Is it theoretically possible? Can it explain for foreign trade when we look at this extension? An economist by the name of Samuelson, he worked on generalizing this trade model to any number of countries, any number of commodities, and any number of factors of production. And what he found is that this does complicate analysis, but the HOS results are still valid. But these results are valid as long as we assume that the number of commodities traded is greater than or equal to the number of factors of production. As long as this condition is satisfied, the HOS model will hold true in a real world situation where we have large number of countries, large number of commodities, and large number of factors of production, obviously being greater than 2. And when we have more than 2 factors of production, what we have to construct is called a factor intensity index. So what commodities require relatively more of one factor relative to others. So here this assumption does not create any problem for the HOS model. In the previous video, I talked about factor intensity reversal, and by that we mean the same commodity is produced using capital intensive technology in a capital abundant country and labor intensive technology in a labor abundant country. And if this happens, or if factor intensity reversal is prevalent, in such a case HOS model breaks down. But then, like I mentioned or explained in my previous lecture video, what economists have concluded is if factor intensity reversal happens, it's a rare phenomena and it's not widespread. So though this is a theoretical possibility, it may happen in certain cases, but then for most part factor intensity reversal is not empirically valid in large number of cases, and hence it does not damage the basic predictions of the HOS model. Next, HOS model assumed that tastes and preferences are the same across countries, and if they are not, then of course these differences in tastes and preferences can become a basis for foreign trade. And economists tested whether tastes and preferences are significantly different across countries, and what they found is they are not, and hence this again is a good assumption used by HOS model, that is, same or similar tastes and preferences exist across countries. But in any case, it does not basically destroy the HOS model. If there are differences, then that can become the basis for foreign trade. The fourth assumption is that there is incomplete specialization in production. Now, this is again something we have discussed earlier. If there is a complete specialization in production, in such a case the HOS model will still be valid, but what will be damaged is the prediction of factor price equalization model. So something to remember is if we have incomplete specialization in production, then HOS model and factor price equalization model hold true. But if we have complete specialization in production in such a, or a straight line PPC, in such a case, the prediction of HOS model are still valid, but factor price equalization will not. The next assumption of HOS model is there is no international factor mobility. And if we drop this assumption, what you should know is the following, and economists have proved this after the publication of the basic HOS model. That is, under HOS framework, given certain assumptions, international factor mobility and international trade are perfect substitutes of one another. So we could have international trade, and in that case we do not require international factor mobility, or if we have international factor mobility, we do not require international trade. So theoretically these two can be perfect substitutes of one another. The next assumption we have made is factors of production are completely mobile between industries, and this is a very simplifying assumption. Ron Jones came up with what is called a specific factors model, where one of the factors is immobile across industries and the other one is perfectly mobile across countries. So specific factors model can just be considered to be a simple extension of the HOS model. The next assumption in terms of HOS model is that same technology prevails in different countries. Now, HOS model is still valid as long as we can treat technology as another factor, and differences in technology can become the basis for foreign trade. Foreign trade based on changes in technology over time cannot be handled by the HOS model. Why? Because HOS is a static model. That means it is looking at the situation at one point in time and is not a dynamic model which looks at situations over time, and hence it is not capable of dynamic analysis. So keep this with yourself about technology. And what has happened is economists have worked in this field. When there are technological differences between countries, how can we explain foreign trade? And one of the model that does it is called the technological gap model or product life cycle model, and that is another theory which can explain foreign trade when we have differences in technology. Now let us look at the next assumption of the HOS model, which is constant returns to scale. And as you will recall, constant returns to scale simply means if we double all inputs, output doubles as well. Now it's entirely possible that in place of constant returns to scale, we may have increasing returns to scale, and that means when we double all inputs, output more than doubles. And if international trade is based on increasing returns to scale, then in such a case we are able to explain a portion of world trade not explained by the HOS model. Now let us look at the last assumption. HOS model assumes perfect competition. Now we know that markets are characterized by imperfect competition, and if we have imperfect competition or we drop this assumption of perfect competition, again we are able to explain a portion of international trade not explained by the HOS model. So now focus on the dropping of 7th, 8th and 9th assumptions in this lecture video. What this has done is it has given us new models which can explain the portion of foreign trade or world trade not explained by the HOS model. So whatever portion of world trade is based on the assumptions we have under HOS model is fairly well able to explain or predict the pattern of foreign trade. And if those assumptions are not valid, then we have newer models of foreign trade which can explain a portion of foreign trade not explained by the HOS model. The world trade can be broken down into two parts depending on the type of trade that takes place. One part is called the inter-industry trade, and here what you are doing is the foreign trade is across different industrial groups. For example, in all the models we have considered, one country will export clothing and import food, and the other country will do exactly the opposite. Or in other words, these countries are trading across different industrial groups. This has to be distinguished from what is called intra-industry trade. Intra means within. So if the world trade is taking place within the same industrial group, it is referred to as intra-industry trade. And what we have seen empirically is that inter-industry trade is trade between dissimilar countries, for example, between developed and developing countries. Chances are developing countries might be exporting agriculture-based products and importing machines, inter-industry trade. As far as intra-industry trade, this is the trade between similar countries. For example, between developed countries, they might be exporting cars and importing cars. They might be exporting airplanes and also importing airplanes. And bulk of the world trade is between developed countries, and most of it is intra-industry trade. So economists have come up with a measure of intra-industry trade, and this measure is denoted by the letter T. And how this is calculated is as follows. T equals 1 minus the absolute value of exports minus imports of the ith industrial group. So we are looking at the same industrial group. And this absolute value divided by exports plus imports of the ith industrial group. Now, just as an example, suppose we are looking at perfect intra-industry trade. That means exports of the ith industrial group must equal the imports of the ith industrial group. Or in other words, this difference will collapse to 0. And if you have 0 in the numerator and divide this by some number, what you will be left with is 0. So the value of T will equal 1 when we have an example of perfect intra-industry trade. What about inter-industry trade? In that case, the country will export, say, some product, but will not import the same product. So exports have some value, just as an example, and imports equal 0. So here what will happen is you'll be dividing exports by exports. So you'll be left with 1. This whole ratio will collapse to 1. And the difference between 1 and 1 is 0. So when we have perfect intra-industry trade, the value of T equals 1. And when we have perfect inter-industry trade, the value of T equals 0. This concludes our discussion of the HOS model. Thank you for your time.